I knew Karen would make a scene the moment her silver SUV nosed up to my timber gate and stopped with the front tires kissing the cattle guard like a challenge, her hazard lights ticking an impatient metronome against the quiet of the pines. But I didn't expect her to lean out the driver's window and say, like she was announcing a weather report, "Open your gate, Daniel. I have guests coming through," as if my land, my fence, my Saturday had just been annexed by the HOA's will. I had coffee in one hand, the remote opener in the other, and behind me the gravel drive ran a quarter-mile through my parcel to the lake, where my cedar-sided cabin squatted on granite like it had shrugged off every winter since 1973. But out front at the easement line, the gate was mine, not the HOA's, not the kind of decorative split-rail entry the brochures showed, but a steel swing gate I'd installed after break-ins last fall, permitted by the county and blessed by the CCNRs so long as it stayed unlocked for emergency access, which it did with a Knox box and a coded padlock shared with the volunteer fire department. Karen didn't care about that or about rules in the way normal people do, not when it conflicted with her need to be obeyed. And she had already wedged her HOA lanyard over a bright scarf like a badge you could salute. So when she said the words, "Open your gate," it wasn't a request, it was the thesis for the day. I said no, calmly, because there's no good that comes from a first yes to an abusive demand. I told her my driveway wasn't a public road and that any guest of hers needed to park at the common lot and take the path to the lake shore like everyone else. I even pointed my coffee toward the HOA's own map, where the easement line stopped at the split-trunk pine, the one the surveyor tagged last spring. She smiled in that saccharine way that means trouble and said, "That's not the community spirit we're after." And I felt the old ache at the base of my neck, the tell that something simple was about to turn complicated. She wasn't alone. In the second row, framed by a stack of boutique gift bags and a folded pop-up canopy, a man in mirrored sunglasses and a woman in a floppy hat watched me like I was a surly doorman blocking a private event. Behind them, two more SUVs idled, one white, one navy, freckling the air with hot exhaust. Someone honked a staccato double tap that meant hurry up, and Karen waved without looking back, ready to translate their impatience into my problem. I could have hit the remote and swung the gate wide. It would have been easier in the moment, but I'd lived easy for a season with our HOA and learned the cost. First it's just a minute, then it's, "We'll clean up tomorrow." Then it's beer cans in, the tools and cigarette butts blackening the duff. The last time I tried easy, a backseat load of guests tore up my shoreline with a rented jet ski and left a scorch circle where they thought a campfire would add ambiance. The sheriff wrote a report and the HOA wrote me a letter about maintaining a neighborly posture. So I didn't open, and Karen leaned further out until the lanyard bowed against her collarbone and said, "I'm president of the board. The Common Dock is hosting a tasting this afternoon. The road through your parcel is the most direct route for high-value attendees," and she put just enough emphasis on high value to make clear whose value counted. I told her the Common Dock had parking, and that the board voted last year not to route private events down residential drives after the insurance carrier balked. She blinked, tilted her head as if listening to an earpiece only she could hear, and said, "Policies evolve," then reached for her phone. Because in our community, threats didn't sound like threats, they sounded like documentation. I had my own documentation. The gate camera chimed on my phone, logging plate numbers, timestamps, and the widening angle of Karen's impatience. I set the coffee on the corner post and felt the steadying weight of the thermos leave my hand. And when I told her she could unload at the lot and that I'd help ferry whatever they needed by cart along the path marked on the HOA map, she gave a tiny, pitying laugh that made the guests in the second row smirk like a chorus line. "You don't want to escalate this," she said, then flicked her eyes to the gate lock. The words snagged me, because I am a man who keeps his head down, pays his dues, cleans up his stretch of shoreline after other people's weekends. Escalating is not my sport, but I also fix the things I own, and I own that gate. I repeated my offer, slower, as if the speed of decency might translate into understanding, and somewhere behind the second SUV a trunk clapped shut, and a voice called, We're late. And that was all the permission Karen needed to pivot from diplomacy to performance. Fine, she said, loud enough for the line of cars to hear. We're invoking emergency access. And she wrapped a manicured hand around the padlock like she intended to snap it off with civic authority. I stepped forward and held up my palm, and for a beat the mountain quiet swallowed the hazard lights and the idling and even Karen's certainty. Emergency access is for emergencies, I said, and I watched the shift in her eyes, the irritation calcifying into strategy. She slid the phone up to video height and panned across my face, my gate, my posted sign that read, Private Drive, Emergency Access Maintained, Trail to Dock. And she narrated for her future email thread. Owner refuses access to community event. Owner is obstructing. Owner is hostile. I didn't give her anything to cut with. I kept my voice even and said, for the recording, owner offers to assist with parking at the common lot and to help transport supplies via the community path. And in the silent half-second after I finished, the man with the mirrored sunglasses muttered, "This is ridiculous," climbed out, and began dragging a rolling cooler over the cattle guard slats toward my fence line. That's when I realized that no matter how clearly the covenants were written, Karen's plan was momentum. Make it awkward, make it public, make it feel like the one who resists is the aggressor. I stepped sideways, not blocking, just standing where a reasonable person could see I owned the dirt I was on. And I said, "The path is on the other side, sir." And he veered toward my wildflower swale with the kind of rich person shrug that means, "What's a plant?" The cooler wheel snagged, tipped, popped its lid, and a wet rope of melting ice and imported cider slithered out across my gravel like a spill on a grocery aisle. Karen sighed theatrically and called to no one in particular. "This is why we need cooperation," then lowered her voice for me. "If you keep this up, Daniel, the board will reassess your compliance history. You've been on notice about that dock ladder." The ladder, 3 inches of aluminum that dipped below the permitted depth. The kind of petty, paper-thin leverage the board loved when it needed to dress a grudge as governance. I could taste metal. My father used to say that's what anger tastes like if you don't swallow it fast enough. I swallowed, then bent, snapped the cooler lid shut, and pushed it gently back to the cattle guard edge. "Lot parking," I said. "Path," I added, pointing. I offered, again, to tow the canopy and the cases on my cart in 2 trips. The woman in the floppy hat looked at me, truly looked, and I could see the math flicker, an easy compromise versus the spectacle Karen promised. She opened her mouth to vote for sense, then Karen shot her a look that said, "Not today." "Everyone back up," Karen commanded, then to me, "Last chance." I didn't move. She put the SUV in park, opened the door, and stood with her phone lifted, recording, while the white SUV behind her inched forward until its grille pressed my gate like a chest bump. "Okay," Karen said brightly to her camera, adopting that sanctimonious tone people reserve for customer service videos. "We're calling the sheriff to report obstruction of common access and harassment." And she dialed, exaggerating every syllable for effect. I could have called too. But there's a hierarchy in rural counties when it comes to who gets believed first, and the HOA president in a scarf outperforms the single guy in work boots 9 times out of 10. So I did something better. I called the fire chief. He answered on the second ring, gravelly and kind. And after I explained the situation in a sentence, private road, permitted gate HOA trying to push event traffic as emergency access, he said, "Don't let them cut that lock," and promised to swing by after he cleared a brush inspection near mile marker 3. While I waited, Karen performed outrage for an audience of car interiors, weaving in phrases like non-compliant owner, safety risk, and board authority, and the line of guests began to fracture into 3 tribes. The ones who believed her and stared daggers at me, the ones who were embarrassed and stared at their laps, and the ones who just wanted their ciders cold by the water and stared at their watches. I held my spot and thought about last winter, about the muddy tire tracks that appeared on my drive after an open house community tour, about the cigarette butt I found still smoldering in the duff 10 feet from my stacked cordwood, About waking at 2 a.m. to lights sweeping my bedroom ceiling. Some joyrider lost and looking for a way out. I thought about what cooperation had meant each time I'd tried it. How it had come back with little nicks and dents and one big scar called lesson learned. Notice of violation, it read in Helvetica that wanted to be a gavel, citing my aggressive posture toward community members, my denial of access to common amenities, and a $250 fine pending board ratification, with a note at the bottom in Karen's compact script. We can make this go away. See me before the meeting. I looked up toward the path, where laughter drifted from the tasting tent like a distant party you weren't invited to. I looked down at the notice, then back at my gate, my sign, my ground. And I realized that saying no at the fence line had only been the first move, because Karen hadn't come here for access. Not really. She'd come to provoke a refusal she could monetize, paper, and weaponize later. The fight wasn't about the road. It was about ownership, and I wasn't just keeping a gate. I was drawing the map for the line I would have to defend when the board came for the ladder, the dock, the dues, and then, inevitably, the cabin itself. I didn't go to the tasting. I went to the shed, flipped on the bare bulb that hummed like an anxious thought, and laid the violation notice on the workbench beside my box of galvanized screws, the ladder bracket, and the plastic bag of rubber feet I'd bought after Karen's safety email last month. I read the notice twice, tracing each vague word with a carpenter's pencil. Aggressive, obstruction, pending, and then I did something I should have done the first week I moved in. I pulled the HOA bylaws and CC&Rs from the canvas satchel, where I'd let them gather dust under the assumption that people who wrote rules wanted to follow them. I found the sections on road easements, private drives, and event routing, highlighted them with a yellow marker that bled through like the law itself was tired of being see-through, and took pictures with my phone so that every time Karen tried to rename reality, I could answer with the one language bullies respect: receipts. Down at the dock, the laughter traveled across the water in sunny bursts that didn't fit the gray pressure sitting behind my eyes. I fixed the ladder, tightened the last bracket, and stood there with the lake slapping at my boots, thinking about how fights like this never end where they start. They metastasize into side arguments, audits, neighbor whispers, board reviews, until you look up and your weekends belong to someone else's agenda. On my way back, I took the long path along the commons, past the tasting tent where white linens billowed like sails, and a small army of volunteers did their best to look effortless. Karen floated near the welcome table with a clipboard and a smile calibrated for donors. She caught sight of me and held my stare a beat too long, then returned to her guest as if I'd been checked off an internal list. That night, a new email landed. Notice of fine, ratification scheduled, with an attached incident summary that read like I'd tackled a marching band. The board meeting was set for Thursday 6 p.m. the clubhouse. Comments limited to 3 minutes. I replied with the parcel map, the deputy's name, the fire chief's statement, and my offer to assist via the path. I copied the general membership list, which Karen hates because sunlight is poison to spin. Within 10 minutes, 2 replies trickled in from neighbors I barely knew. One said, "Thanks for clarifying." The other, "Didn't know the event was coming through your place." Then came a direct message from someone I did know. Helen, 2 cul-de-sacs over, who grows tomatoes like a hobbyist miracle and once flagged me down to return a dropped glove. "Watch your mail," she wrote. "Karen's canvassing signatures for safety improvements. She'll make it sound like you're the hazard." I thanked her. She sent a second message. "Also, your security cam caught late-night foot traffic last week. You might want more lights." That last line made my scalp prickle. I pulled the gate footage and scrubbed through. Between 11:52 p.m. and 12:07 a.m. the week before, a pair of figures ducked around the cattle guard and walked the fence line. At 12:05, a flash, maybe a lighter, flared near my woodpile. They left nothing obvious, but if you've ever had a break-in, you know the feeling that follows, that your home is only yours until someone decides to borrow it. I ordered 2 more motion lights and a second trail cam, same brand, cheaper than a deductible. Wednesday morning, Karen's flyer arrived in a stack of mailers like a wolf in stationery. Community safety petition, improved access for emergency vehicles and guests, with bullet points that danced around the words Daniel and Gate, but aimed at both. She framed it as a fix for confusing signage, narrow roadways, and risk of delayed response. I stood at my kitchen island and read it while my kettle whistled. Then I wrote my own one page, no adjectives, only facts, CC&Rs, section numbers, county permit number, statements from Sloan and the chief, photos of the parcel line and my emergency lockbox, plus a reminder that the board voted last May to prohibit routing private events down residential drives. I printed 30 copies and spent my lunch walking door to door. 6 neighbors opened. 4 were polite. 2 were quietly furious, not at me, but at the creeping sense that the HOA had become a stage for petty tyrants. One man, a retired teacher named Bert with eyebrows like winter brush, invited me in and showed me his own stack, a violation for leaving a canoe by the shoreline, visual clutter, a fine for a non-conforming mailbox post he'd installed 20 years ago, and a letter inviting him to join the landscaping committee under Karen's chairmanship. They don't want volunteers, he said. They want witnesses to their importance. I left his place with a list of names he said would speak if things got noisy. Thursday came. The clubhouse smelled like lemon cleaner and policy. Folding chairs faced a dais where 3 board members sat like judges at a science fair. Karen in the center, flanked by a treasurer whose eyes flickered with the panicked math of pending dues, and a secretary who typed like she was taking dictation for an affidavit. The room filled with that slosh of neighbor energy. Awkward hellos, averted gazes, the few loud voices who treat meetings as open mic. Karen called the meeting to order at exactly 6, her gavel more ornamental than functional, and plowed through minutes, maintenance, the success of the tasting, and then the item I'd come for. Owner non-compliance, obstruction of access. She read the incident summary in a tone of concern polished to a shine. Swapping wine tasting for community event and private driveway for secondary access route. When she finished, she let the quiet sit like a verdict. I stood. 3 minutes, she said, looking at the timer like it might bite her. I spoke in that clipped register you use when you're threading a needle in public. Facts, sequence, law, deputy's statement, chief's statement, my offers to assist. I mentioned the Navy SUV rocking the gate and Sloan's warning. I mentioned the vote last May. I did not mention my opinion of her tactics. I did not mention how the word aggressive can be tossed around like confetti until it sticks to whoever you need it to. I stopped with 10 seconds left. Karen smiled at her laptop. Thank you, she said. We'll take your remarks under advisement. Then she tried to move on. That's when Helen, bless her, stood and said, Point of order, in a voice that came from a life before tomatoes. A murmur went through the rows. Karen frowned. Point of order is oxygen for people like her, but only when it comes from her hand. Helen asked for the vote from last May to be read into the minutes. The secretary paused, looked to Karen, then reluctantly opened a PDF and read, Board prohibits routing private events through residential drives, effective immediately. The room shifted. Bert raised his hand. Is the secondary access route a residential drive? The treasurer cleared his throat. It's, on Mr. Hale's parcel. Then it's residential, Bert said. Karen's smile thinned. We were operating under an emergency access policy, she said, trying to splice 2 unrelated rules together like cords that won't take a knot. The fire chief, who'd slipped in late and taken a chair near the back, stood up without waiting to be recognized. Emergency access is for emergencies, he said. We told you that last month and last year. Silence, except for the secretary's keyboard as she tried to keep up. The treasurer leaned into his mic. Given the new information, he began, and Karen's head turned so sharply I heard the air move. I motioned to table the fine pending review. He said new information, like he'd just discovered gravity. Really, he'd discovered an audience of neighbors who didn't appreciate being used as props. They voted. 2 for tabling, Karen against. The fine wasn't dead, but it was off the calendar. She pivoted fast, dragging the spotlight to a new item, dock safety and compliance. and clicked a slide showing a zoomed, unflattering photo of my ladder before I'd replaced the bracket. She called it non-conforming and hazardous, and I felt a tired laugh rise in my throat because of course we were here. If she couldn't beat me at the gate, the fight would move to the water. I started to speak, but Helen cut in again. He fixed it yesterday. And I pulled up my phone and showed time-stamped photos, including the chief standing on my dock, telling me the lock was fine. Karen tried to wring some blood from the word process, that I hadn't submitted a corrective action form. Around 11, a car rolled by on the county road and didn't turn in. Somewhere, an owl questioned the dark. At midnight, the new cam caught a young fox nosing the base of my fence, utterly uninterested in human theater. I slept badly, the kind of sleep that interprets every pine's groan as a footstep. At dawn, coffee in hand, I walked the fence line and found a piece of blue ribbon snagged on a blackberry cane, the kind used to mark tree limbs during HOA beautification days. It could have blown there. It could have fallen from a volunteer's pocket. It could have also been tied around a wrist that trespassed with a camera yesterday evening. I put it in a bag and wrote the date on the plastic with a Sharpie, hating the version of myself that was learning to treat neighbors like suspects. Mid-morning, an email from Karen. Given last night's unfortunate developments, reports of vandalism near the Commons, we are convening a special meeting to discuss community safety. Attendance strongly encouraged. I stared at the screen until my reflection looked like a stranger. There hadn't been vandalism near the Commons. There had been a cheap threat on my bench. But now the narrative would be rewritten. The location shifted, the blame diffused, and the solution pre-baked. Cameras on the trail, more keys circulating for rapid response, perhaps even a bylaw amendment about access continuity that would clip my gate at the hinges. I answered with one line. Any discussion of safety should include respect for property lines and adherence to the May resolution. She replied with a smiley face and absolutely, which told me she was already counting votes. The last thing I did before noon was call a lawyer. I didn't hire him. Couldn't afford to yet, but I paid for an hour and used it like a tourniquet, asking exactly how far the board could push, what language mattered, what to document, when to escalate, when to sue. He told me 3 things worth the fee: record every interaction, never be the first to raise your voice, and when they overreach, don't argue, invite a judge. HOAs run on bully energy until someone flips the breaker, he said. After I hung up, I sat with my back against the cool of my cabin's siding and realized the shape of what was coming, a tug-of-war dressed as a safety campaign. A series of small moral injuries that felt too petty to fight until, stacked, they weighed as much as losing. So I did one more thing before I went back to my workday. I printed a new sign for the gate in a font even Karen would respect, laminated against the weather. Private drive, emergency access only. Community path. Then smaller, a line I added for myself as much as for them, documenting audio-video. When I hung it, I did not feel safe. I felt ready. By Friday, the air itself felt charged, like the mountain was waiting for something to snap, and every sound, the crunch of tires on gravel, the thud of mail against the box, made me brace for the next move. It came, of course, in the form of an HOA email blast titled Community Security Update, Karen's masterpiece. It framed the recent vandalism as evidence that restricted zones encouraged confusion and unsafe behaviors, that cooperative openness was the key to harmony, and, without naming me, warned about isolated actions that obstruct communal oversight. The subtext was neon. I was the vandal by omission, the holdout causing disorder. Within hours, the gossip engine roared. 2 neighbors stopped waving. One left a passive-aggressive note about fire truck clearance, and someone knocked over my trash bin like punctuation. I didn't rise to it. I logged every incident, date, time, photo. Helen texted, "Brace yourself. She's pushing an amendment." She was right. By Monday, a draft resolution circulated to ensure emergency responsiveness and event coordination. Private gates within HOA boundaries must remain open during designated hours. The clause was short, surgical, and catastrophic. It would turn my locked gate into a suggestion. I spent that night combing the bylaws for procedural escape hatches, highlighting every phrase about unanimous consent of affected owners and easement limitations. I found my leverage. Any alteration of access had to include county review. That bought time. If I could stall until the next quarterly inspection, maybe Karen's momentum would crumble. But she anticipated resistance. Tuesday morning, a county code officer arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, saying he'd received a citizen complaint about obstruction. He turned out to be decent, bored rather than hostile. And when he saw my permit number bolted to the post, he nodded and said, "You're fine," then sighed. "They do this every year to someone." Still, the message was clear. Karen had learned to weaponize bureaucracy. That night, my motion sensors tripped 3 times between midnight and 1. Nothing visible on the cameras except a single bouncing reflection far back among the trees like a phone flashlight catching a path. I stayed inside, lights off, pulse hammering, wondering if it was kids or Karen's allies testing my patience. At dawn, I walked the fence line and found fresh footprints where pine needles had been crushed into the soil. 2 sets, adult, 1 heavier. I photographed them with a ruler beside for scale. By mid-morning, the HOA's group chat, once used for lost pets and bake sales, was a rumor mill. Someone posted, "Maybe if certain people didn't block emergency routes, trespassers wouldn't get confused." Another replied with a laughing emoji. I didn't defend myself. I let them talk, knowing silence makes the guilty hunt their own echoes, but it wore me down. The constant alertness, the sideways glances at the store, the feeling that my own porch light was a stage. I started seeing Karen everywhere, in the reflection of the gas pump, in the SUV, 2 cars back at the market, in my dreams where she sat at my kitchen table reading bylaws to my walls. Thursday, the special meeting arrived. The clubhouse overflowed. Curiosity draws crowds better than wine. Karen opened with solemnity fit for a memorial. "We've had incidents undermining our shared safety. Tonight we'll vote on protective measures." She introduced a slideshow, photos of my gate, my private drive sign, even a zoomed still from my camera where I was tightening the hinge, captioned, "Restricted access creates risk." My throat tightened. She'd turned my own surveillance into propaganda. When she called for public comment, Helen rose first, voice steady but sharp. "What risk?" she asked. "The only incidents have happened to Daniel, not because of him." Murmurs spread. Bert stood too. "Emergency vehicles already have access. This is about control." Karen's mask cracked for half a second before she said, "This is about community trust." Then, as if on cue, the Navy SUV man from before, the one who'd rammed my gate, raised his hand. "I saw him outside last night with a flashlight," he said, loud enough for everyone. "Looked like he was watching us." Gasps. Lies move faster than facts. I started to protest, but Sloan walked in, uniform crisp, timing immaculate. He took the floor without waiting to be recognized. "I was the one who suggested extra patrols," he said. "Mr. Hale's been targeted, not the other way around. Whoever left that package is under investigation." The room stilled. Karen tried to recover. "We appreciate law enforcement's partnership." Sloan wasn't done. "And since this keeps coming up," he said, lifting a document, "here's the fire chief's statement confirming the gate complies with emergency regulations." He pinned it to the corkboard like a trophy. The silence that followed was pure oxygen. Karen blinked, recalibrated, then pivoted to next agenda item, pretending defeat was procedure. But something shifted. You could feel it. People whispered not about me, but about her, about power, about overreach. I left quietly before she could conjure another target. Outside, dusk burned red between the trees, and I realized how long I'd been holding my breath. I thought it was over. That reason had finally outlasted theater. Then, as I reached my truck, my phone buzzed. An alert from the backtrail camera, motion detected. I opened the feed. Grainy image, timestamped 6:47 p.m. 2 figures again, one holding what looked like a gas can, walking toward the dock. My chest went cold. I called Sloan, heart stuttering, and drove down the trail with headlights off, coasting the last stretch. At the shoreline, the air reeked faintly of fuel, but the water shimmered undisturbed. Then I saw it. A small plastic container bobbing near the ladder, tied to a string anchored on shore. Inside, a lighter, same cheap model as before. A message, deliberate and mocking. I hauled it out, hands trembling, and the wind carried a laugh, or maybe just a branch breaking. I stared across the lake where porch lights blinked on, dozens of cabins lined like watching eyes. And I understood what Karen's community really meant. A kingdom of witnesses who would believe whatever the loudest voice told them. The fight had started as property lines and rules, but now it was personal, primal, a struggle for the right to feel safe on my own soil. I pocketed the lighter, looked back at the path glowing under the motion lights, and knew I was past halfway between law and something darker, the kind of justice that doesn't fit in meeting minutes, but lives in the quiet resolve of a man pushed too far. When the second lighter hit my palm and the smell of gasoline bled through the air, something in me changed. Not rage exactly, but a steadiness. The kind you feel when there's no higher authority left to appeal to. I realized I was standing in the middle of a story Karen thought she controlled, but she'd underestimated what happens when a quiet man runs out of exits. I drove straight to the county sheriff's substation, handed Sloan the can and the photo evidence, and signed the complaint myself. Criminal mischief, harassment, trespass, whatever stuck. He promised to pull plate records from the cameras I'd logged, said he'd loop in the fire chief since accelerants near docks meant real danger. "Lock it down, Daniel," he said, and I heard in his tone that mix of sympathy and warning that comes from watching too many feuds burn past the point of law. Back home, I chained the gate, double-checked the emergency key box, and sat inside with the lights low, listening to rain slide off the roof like whispered apologies. The next morning, Karen's silence was louder than any email blast. No flyers, no petitions, no public outrage, just absence, which worried me more. The board chat went quiet too, and for a day I thought maybe the evidence had done its job. Then Saturday dawned bright and brittle, and I woke to hammering on my fence. Outside, a work crew in reflective vests was dismantling my sign and prying at the hinge bolts. "County order," one called, waving a clipboard. I took the paper, scanned it. No seal, no signature, just a photocopied letterhead and Karen's typed name beneath Acting Safety Liaison. I almost laughed. She'd forged bureaucratic theater into action. I dialed Sloan, but he was already en route. Someone else had called about disturbance at Hale property. He arrived, lights flashing, and the workers froze when they saw his uniform. He read the letter, frowned, and said flatly, "This isn't county." He handed it back to me and told them, "Pack it up." They left muttering. Karen appeared minutes later in her SUV, pretending surprise, her voice all honey. "Oh, miscommunication. I only requested an inspection." Sloan didn't even look at her. "You're interfering with an active investigation," he said, and that drained the color from her face. She tried to charm, failed, and finally drove off. When the dust settled, Sloan said, "We found partial prints on the gas can. Not yours. Waiting on match." He didn't have to say it. We both knew whose hands those would trace to. By evening, the HOA thread lit up again, but this time the tone was fractured, half defensive, half curious. Someone leaked that law enforcement was involved, that board documents were being reviewed. The story was escaping Karen's script. Helen stopped by with a pie and quiet news. 2 board members had resigned for personal reasons, the treasurer among them. "People are scared," she said. "Not of you, of her." I thanked her, and for the first time in weeks the cabin felt like a home again, not a bunker. That night I sat on the dock under a bowl of stars, the repaired ladder cold against my feet, and wondered how peace always comes disguised as aftermath. Around 10, my phone buzzed, a voicemail from Sloan. His voice was low, careful. "Prince came back. Your HOA president's husband. We'll be bringing them in tomorrow. Thought you should know before the rumor mill does." I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I heard the echo of tires on the county road and stepped outside just as the unmarked car stopped at Karen's driveway. 2 deputies walked her husband out in handcuffs, head down, no fight. She stood on the porch in a robe, arms crossed, face pale as lake fog. For a second, our eyes met across the distance, and in that silent span, we both understood the cost. Her authority collapsing, my solitude finally vindicated but emptied of triumph. The cars left, the sound faded, and all that remained was the ordinary quiet of a mountain morning, the kind that used to mean safety. Later that week, a notice arrived, this one official. Board dissolution, special election pending. The county had intervened after multiple complaints and falsified documents. Helen was named interim chair until new elections. At the bottom, in smaller print, a line that made me exhale for real. Previous fines rescinded. I tacked it to the wall like a medal. Spring rolled in. The lake thawed. Neighbors started waving again, tentative at first, then genuine. Bert dropped by with coffee and said, "Told you bullies implode on paperwork." We laughed quietly, the way survivors do. Karen's house went up for sale a month later. Relocation opportunity, the listing said. I didn't attend the showing, but I watched from my porch as strangers toured the place, oblivious to the history soaked into its siding. By summer, her SUV was gone for good, and the HOA's newsletters shrank to one page about trail maintenance and picnic dates. On the anniversary of the gate incident, I replaced the old sign with a new one, same words, fresh paint, and screwed it in with calm hands. The gate creaked open to the breeze, then closed on its own, a small, satisfying sound. When I walked back down to the dock that evening, the water mirrored the sky in silver strips, and for the first time in months, my reflection looked like a man instead of a headline. I sat there until the light bled out, thinking about how every community builds its monsters out of good intentions and unchecked power, how every fight for boundaries is really a fight to keep a piece of yourself intact. In the end, justice hadn't come from revenge or cleverness, just persistence, the quiet refusal to yield. Behind me, the motion light clicked on, catching the gate in a soft halo. It stood there steady and locked, not as a barricade, but as proof that some lines, once defended, stay drawn.